The fog hadn't lifted off the Providence harbor when Arya Hale walked up the long gravel drive to the Vance estate, a single worn duffel bag over her shoulder, and she heard the screaming before she ever saw the stables. It wasn't a human sound. It was a hoarse high, frantic, the kind of sound that goes straight past your ears and lands somewhere behind your ribs. She started to run. The courtyard opened up in front of her, all wet stone and black iron, and it was full of men shouting over each other. In the middle of them, a black stallion reared against a wall of ropes, hooves cutting the gray air, eyes rolled white with terror, and on the steps above them all stood a tall man in a charcoal coat, 37 years old, still as carved stone, watching it all fall apart without lifting a finger. "Put it down," he said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Ezra Vance never had to. A man near the arch already had a pistol halfway up. "Don't." The word came out of Arya before she'd decided to say it. She was small, plain, 27. Nobody to a single soul on that gravel. Still wearing the worn, simple traveling clothes she had arrived in, and she stepped straight into the open and pushed that gun barrel down toward the ground. Then she walked toward the animal that had already put one man in the dirt. She didn't stare it down. She made herself small and quiet, the way her father had taught her on a Kentucky horse farm a lifetime ago. And she waited, 1 minute, 2. And that black stallion, the most dangerous horse on the whole estate, the one no living soul had been able to touch, lowered its head and pressed its muzzle right into the palm of a stranger. That was the moment Ezra Vance came down off those steps like a storm, pointing a finger straight in her face, roaring at her. And Arya, her hand still resting soft on the trembling animal's neck, looked the most feared man in the city dead in the eye and didn't flinch. He turned to his oldest man and said it flat, cold, certain. "She won't last a month here." He had no idea how wrong he was about to be. If stories about quiet people with unbreakable spines are your kind of thing, do us a favor and tap that like button. Share this with someone who needs it tonight, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. Now, let's head back up that foggy drive to the Vance estate and meet Arya Hale. The 61-year-old man standing beneath the portico stepped down onto the damp stone stair without saying a word and lifted the worn canvas bag from Arya's shoulder with his own hands before she could protest. His name was Merrick, though she wouldn't learn that until later. But in that moment he was merely a tall, lean shadow in a dark suit, with neatly trimmed silver hair and a face as still as the surface of a frozen lake, revealing nothing she could possibly read. He led her around the gravel courtyard, away from the place where the men were still cleaning up, and opened a heavy wooden door that led into the heart of the Vance estate. Inside, the first thing that touched Arya was the cold. It wasn't the cold of the weather, but a damp, stale chill that crept upward from the marble beneath her feet and traveled all the way along her spine, the cold of a place so wealthy it had no need to offer warmth to anyone but itself. The ceiling soared so high that it vanished into darkness. Crystal chandeliers hung suspended overhead, yet only half their bulbs had been lit, and their sickly yellow glow cast uneven patches of light and shadow across the walls, making the entire corridor look like an old painting that had been forgotten. There was the scent of wood polish, the fading perfume of lilies beginning to wilt inside silver vases, and beneath it all, something harder to name, the smell of rooms whose doors hadn't been opened in a very long time. Arya followed Merrick, the sound of her shoes ringing dry and hollow against the stone floor. And she couldn't help noticing that although the mansion held a fortune within every gilded picture frame, every Persian rug, and every intricately carved grandfather clock, there was no laughter, no murmur of conversation, no sign that anyone truly lived there. The place felt more like a lavishly decorated tomb than a home. They passed through a long series of corridors, turned left, then climbed a narrow servant's staircase, and it was while crossing the second floor that Arya finally saw it. At the far end of an eastern hallway, where almost no light could reach, stood a pair of closed double doors made of dark wood. A faded red velvet rope had been stretched across the entrance, as though to bar the way, and a thin layer of dust still rested, untouched, upon the handles, revealing that no human hand had reached for them in a very long time. Arya slowed by half a step. She could feel something heavy radiating from those doors, a silence even denser than the silence filling the rest of the house. Merrick, though walking ahead of her without once turning around, seemed to sense where her eyes had settled. "The East Wing isn't your concern," he said, his voice low and dry, the first words he had spoken since meeting her. "No one goes in there. No one." Arya didn't ask why. She had learned long ago that inside another person's home, Questions were the most dangerous luxury of all, and closed doors always had their reasons. Reasons a newly arrived maid had no business knowing. She merely nodded and continued walking, but the sight of those doors had already carved a quiet question into her mind. They went farther, nearly all the way beneath the roof, where the ceiling lowered and the luxurious carpets gave way to bare wooden floors, and Merrick stopped before a small room. He pushed the door open. Inside stood a single bed, an old wardrobe, and a narrow window overlooking the rear courtyard and the mist-blurred fields in the distance. "Your room," he said, setting the canvas bag at the foot of the bed with a strange degree of care, before handing her a neatly pressed housekeeper's uniform, as though it were something precious rather than the worn luggage of a hired servant. "Breakfast is at 6 o'clock. Madam takes tea at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Mr. Vance." He paused for a moment so slight it was almost invisible. "Mr. Vance dines alone. You needn't concern yourself with him." Arya looked at him, and for the first time she allowed herself to study the man more closely. The way his shoulders seemed to sag beneath the weight of something she couldn't yet name. The way his eyes lingered briefly on the threshold as though he were considering words he wanted to speak but ultimately chose to swallow. "Thank you," she said softly. Merrick didn't answer. He only looked at her for another moment, with the gaze of a man who had served in that house long enough to know exactly what usually happened to young women who dared to cross its threshold. And then he turned away, closing the door behind him with a faint click. Left alone, Arya stood in the middle of the small, cold room, listening as his footsteps faded and finally disappeared into the depths of the enormous house. She walked to the window, pressed her palm against the icy glass, and stared out at the mist rising from the dark earth below. Somewhere beneath her, inside a stable she couldn't yet see clearly, the black animal was still there, and so was the man who had ordered it put to death. This place, she thought, pulling her thin coat more tightly around her shoulders, this place had far too many things locked away, and the things people locked away, a lifetime of hardship had taught her, usually weren't meant to keep someone outside, but to imprison something within. At 6 o'clock in the morning, while the mist still hung outside the narrow window, Arya was already downstairs in the kitchen, and it was the first place in the mansion that offered her even the faintest trace of genuine warmth. The vast kitchen had copper pans hanging along the walls and an old oven that still breathed out heat. But even there, the warmth was covered by an undercurrent of tension that Arya sensed from the moment she stepped inside. The woman standing beside the cutting board was around 50, broad and full-figured, with reddened hands and salt and pepper hair twisted into a hurried bun. She was Greta, the Vance family cook. She looked up at Arya with an expression that was both searching and weary, the look of someone who had watched too many new faces arrive, only to disappear again. "You're the new one," Greta said, not quite as a question, then jerked her head toward a stack of tablecloths that needed folding. Arya didn't say much. She simply rolled up her sleeves and began working, and while her hands stayed busy, her eyes quietly took in everything around her. She noticed the spreading water stains across the kitchen ceiling where some pipe had been leaking for a long time. She saw spice jars nearly empty and never refilled, faded curtains, and a chair with a broken leg propped in the corner, waiting for a repair that never came. The mansion was wealthy enough to blind the eye, yet beneath its gilded surface, something was quietly rotting away, like a towering tree that still stood proud and strong, while its heart had already hollowed from within. At around 8 o'clock, the kitchen door swung open and a man walked in, and Arya felt the change in the air before she could even see his face clearly. Greta stiffened beside the cutting board, her shoulders drawing inward like a small animal instinctively shrinking from danger. The man was about 44, neatly dressed in an expensive gray suit, with a ruddy face and a permanent smile resting on his lips, a smile Arya immediately recognized as one that never reached his eyes. His name was Hollis Brandt, and the way everyone else in the kitchen suddenly fell silent and lowered their heads toward their work told her enough about who he was within that house. "Greta," Hollis said, his voice dangerously sweet, "this week's meat bill is higher than I allowed. Would you care to explain that to me?" The cook stammered, her reddened hands clutching tightly at her apron, saying that prices at the market had risen, that she had bought only what the household needed. Hollis listened without changing his smile, then tilted his head, his voice still gentle, though a blade lay hidden beneath it. "I decide what is spent in this house, Greta, not you. If numbers are becoming difficult for you, perhaps it's time I found someone else who finds them easier." The kitchen sank into silence. Greta lowered her face, her lips pressed tightly together, and Arya could clearly see humiliation and fear struggling across the older woman's features. She stood still beside the folded linens, her head slightly bowed, saying nothing, but inside, she was quietly recording every detail, the way Hollis looked around the kitchen as though calculating the value of everything in it, the way his eyes passed over her and then lingered a moment longer than they should have, like a cat that had just noticed a strange creature entering its territory. "Who are you?" Hollis asked, his voice still sweet. "The new girl," Greta answered for her. "Madam hired her." Hollis's smile widened. "Ah," he said, "another one." Then he turned and walked out, and the entire kitchen seemed to release its breath when the door closed behind him. Greta remained still for a moment, then hurriedly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and returned to her work without saying anything more. But Arya had already seen enough. Throughout the rest of that day, as she moved through the corridors, carrying clean linens to the bedrooms and wiping dust from the clouded window frames, she quietly observed an entire household living in fear. The servants spoke in whispers and fell silent whenever she passed. A young maid named Millie startled so badly at the sound of footsteps behind her that she dropped an entire tray, then began apologizing frantically as though she had committed some terrible crime. Arya helped her gather the broken pieces without offering a single word of blame, and the gratitude mixed with surprise in the girl's eyes told Arya more than any explanation could have. This was a house where kindness had become so rare that it left people astonished. By evening, when Arya returned to her small room beneath the roof, she sat on the edge of the bed, her legs exhausted and her shoulders aching after the long day, and allowed herself to absorb the truth she had uncovered in only a few short hours. The Vance mansion wasn't dying because it lacked money. It was dying from something else, something that moved through every lowered gaze, every whispered voice, every locked door. It was dying from fear. And somewhere upstairs, the man who ruled over all that fear was sitting alone at dinner, in silence, at the head of a long table with no one beside him. Arya didn't know why, but the thought sent a strange ache through. That night, after the entire mansion had sunk into the dense, suffocating silence of a house far too large for the number of people living within it, Arya locked her bedroom door, slid the bolt into place, and sat down on the cold wooden floor beside the bed. She pulled the worn canvas bag toward her hands pausing for a moment over the zipper before she opened it. Inside were only a few old changes of clothes, a comb, and a notebook with curled edges, the meager possessions of a woman who had nothing left to lose. But those weren't what Arya was looking for. Her fingers reached down to the bottom of the bag, searching for the seam she had sewn back together with her own hands. And beneath the fabric lining, in a place no one would ever think to search, she touched something hard, small and flat, wrapped in plastic and tape, a portable hard drive. She didn't take it out. She merely pressed her fingertips lightly against it through the fabric, as though needing to reassure herself that it was still there, still real, still the ticking time bomb she had carried all the way from Kentucky to this cold, distant coast. Simply feeling its weight was enough to tighten her chest, shorten her breath, and drag the memories she had tried so desperately to bury back to the surface like corpses rising through dark water. She closed her eyes, drew in a deep breath, and reminded herself of what she had repeated through so many sleepless nights, that as long as the hard drive remained hidden, as long as no one knew who she truly was, she was still safe. She withdrew her hand, carefully smoothed the lining until it looked exactly as it had before, then reached into the innermost pocket and took out something else, a set of identification papers. Beneath the sickly yellow glow of the bedside lamp, she turned through them, and a bitter smile briefly touched the corner of her mouth. The name on the documents was real, Arya Hale. It was the name her parents had given her, the only thing she had managed to preserve from a life that had shattered beyond repair. But the address was false, an apartment in a city she had never visited. The reference was false, a name she had invented and a telephone number connected to an empty voicemail box she hoped no one would ever bother calling. Her employment history had been stitched together from fragments of truth and carefully shaped lies, convincing enough that a wealthy woman urgently in need of help wouldn't trouble herself to investigate too closely. Arya had learned how to do such things not because she was a swindler, but because it was the only way a woman on the run could disappear without leaving a trace behind. She put the documents away, turned off the lamp, then climbed into bed and pulled the thin blanket all the way to her chin. But sleep didn't come. She lay in the darkness, listening to the wind slip through the cracks around the window, and allowed her mind to drift backward toward the place she had left behind. She thought of Kentucky, of green fields stretching beneath an endless sky, of the scent of hay and horses in her father's barn, of the early mornings when he had taught her how to make a terrified animal trust the touch of her hand. She thought of the last house where she had worked, the house where everything had begun to collapse, where she had accidentally seen something she should never have seen and heard something she should never have heard. She didn't allow herself to travel any farther down that path of memory. She had learned that some doors inside the mind needed to be locked as tightly as the doors of a mansion, and opening them after midnight only ensured that sleep would never come. The only thing she permitted herself to remember was the feeling of that night, the night she had hurriedly stuffed a few clothes into a bag and fled from everything, her heart pounding, her hands trembling, with only one thought in her mind, that if she stayed, she would die, and that there were powerful, patient people who would never stop searching for her. Arya opened her eyes in the darkness and stared up at the low ceiling of the servants' room, and the bitter irony of it nearly made her laugh. She had escaped from one mansion filled with secrets and danger, only to hide inside another, one that might be even darker and more dangerous than the place she had left behind, the home of a Mafia boss, a place where every wall had ears, every servant knew fear, and the man who ruled over them all could order a life ended in a voice so calm it chilled the blood. Yet perhaps, she told herself, that was precisely what made it the perfect hiding place. After all, who would think to search for a woman in hiding inside the tiger's den itself? She only needed to make herself small, quiet, invisible, to do her work as a maid, keep her head lowered and her mouth closed, and wait until it was safe to move on. Only a matter of time, she thought. Perhaps she needed only to stay long enough to find her footing. She could remain invisible for now. She had been invisible for almost her entire life already. What she couldn't possibly have known, as she finally drifted into sleep inside that cold room, was that the Vance mansion would never allow anyone within its walls to remain truly invisible. On her third day at the mansion, Arya had her first direct encounter with Ezra Vance since that stormy first morning in the courtyard. It happened in the evening, when one of the maids suddenly fell ill, and Greta, her face tense, pressed a heavy silver tray into Arya's hands, telling her to take dinner to the grand dining room and repeating over and over that she was to set it down and leave at once. Say nothing, don't stare, and do nothing that might draw his attention. Arya nodded, lifted the tray, and followed the long corridor leading to the room she had only heard about until then. The dining room door stood slightly open, and when she stepped inside, the sight before her made her pause for half a step. The room was vast, with a ceiling soaring far overhead, and dark wood-paneled walls covered in portraits of Vance's ancestors, their stern faces staring down from the shadows. At the center stood a dining table so impossibly long that it could seat 20 people, draped in pure white linen, with silver and crystal gleaming beneath the candlelight. And at the far end of that table, alone, sat Ezra Vance. He sat upright in the chair at the head, with a set of silver cutlery and a single plate before him, while the empty space stretched out ahead like a river without banks. The other 19 chairs were vacant, arranged neatly along both sides of the table, chairs no one ever occupied, and Arya suddenly realized that the scene didn't resemble a dinner at all. It looked like a man eating at the head of a coffin. She approached as quietly as she could and placed the dishes before him exactly as Greta had instructed. Ezra didn't look up. His gaze remained fixed ahead, passing through the emptiness of the table toward some distant place only he could see. In the candlelight, his face was beautiful in a cold and guarded way, every sharp line seeming carved from stone, but it was his eyes that kept Arya from leaving at once as she had intended. Those dark blue eyes, she realized, held none of the cruelty she had imagined in a Mafia boss. They held something else, a bottomless emptiness, an exhaustion rooted so deeply it had reached the very core of him, the look of a man who could no longer remember when he had stopped feeling anything at all. He picked up his fork, but he didn't eat. He merely held it suspended above the plate for a moment, then set it down again, as though even the act of keeping himself alive demanded an effort he no longer had the strength to make. Arya had already retreated toward the door, but she stopped for a moment at the threshold, and in that instant, she looked at him not with the fearful eyes of a servant, but with the eyes of someone who had known loss, someone who knew what it meant to sink. And what she saw made her chest tighten. This wasn't a monster seated upon the throne of a criminal empire. This was a man drowning in the middle of his own magnificent room, drowning in wealth and power and silence, while no one in that vast house reached out to save him, because they were all too afraid to approach a man who was going under. Perhaps she had remained there a moment too long, Or perhaps the instinct of a predator could always sense when someone's eyes were upon him. But Ezra suddenly lifted his head, and those dark blue eyes met hers directly. Arya knew she should lower her gaze at once, should withdraw as quickly as Greta had told her, but something held her in place, and for an instant that seemed to stretch without end, the two strangers simply looked at one another across the length of the empty table. She didn't look away. She wasn't afraid. She only looked at him, quietly and calmly, with no judgment, no pleading, no scrutiny, only the gaze of one human being truly seeing another. And she saw something flicker in the depths of his eyes, a brief confusion, almost astonishment, as though he wasn't accustomed to being looked at that way, as though it had been a very long time since anyone had dared meet his eyes without lowering their own in terror. "You're the one who calmed the horse," he said. His voice was deep and dry, and it wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Arya answered softly. He studied her for another moment, and seemed about to say something more, but then the door within him closed as quickly as it had opened, and he merely tilted his head to dismiss her. "You may go." Arya bowed, turned, and left the dining room, closing the door behind her. But as she stood alone in the dark corridor, her heart was beating strangely fast, and it wasn't from fear. She leaned back against the cold wall, and the image of that lonely man sitting at the head of the long table kept echoing through her mind, along with a thought she couldn't drive away, that somewhere inside all that ice, a good man was trapped, slowly drowning, and waiting, though perhaps he didn't even know it himself, for someone brave enough not to turn away. The next morning, while Arya was folding linens in the laundry room, Merrick appeared in the doorway with his usual rigid posture and informed her that the mistress of the house wished to see her. The mistress, he emphasized with a formality that made Arya understand this wasn't an invitation she could refuse, was Vera Wolfe, Ezra Vance's grandmother, the woman Arya had so far heard mentioned only in voices that mingled reverence with unease. Arya was led to a small sitting room in the south wing, the only place in the mansion where real sunlight entered through the tall windows, and seated there, upright in a high-backed armchair, was a 79-year-old woman with silver-white hair, arranged in a neat bun, and eyes so sharp that Arya felt they could see through flesh and read everything she was hiding beneath it. Vera didn't invite her to sit at once. She merely looked her over from head to toe in a silence long enough to make most people shift with discomfort, but Arya remained still, her hands folded before her, her gaze calm, enduring the scrutiny without wavering. At last, the old woman spoke, her voice rough but precise. "You aren't what I expected," Vera said. Arya quietly replied that she was sorry if she had disappointed her. "I didn't say I was disappointed," Vera cut in sharply. "I said you aren't what I expected. Those are two entirely different things, girl. And if you intend to survive in this house, you'd better learn the difference." She tilted her head toward the chair opposite her, signaling for Arya to sit. "Not there. Here, where I can see your face clearly." Arya sat down. "My grandson says you calmed the black horse within your first hour here," Vera said, her piercing eyes never leaving Arya's face. "Do you know how many large, strong men have given up on that animal over the past year?" Arya answered that the horse wasn't vicious, only grieving, and that a grieving creature couldn't be forced into obedience. All anyone could do was show it that they weren't a threat. Vera remained silent for a long time after that, and something changed in her eyes. The cold sharpness softened, giving way to an ancient and bottomless sorrow. "That horse belonged to Corinne," she said quietly. "My grandson's wife." Arya said nothing. "She died 14 months ago," Vera continued, her gaze turning toward the windows and the distant fields beyond them. "She was young, only 30, and she was the only person who kept this house breathing. She managed everything. She knew every servant by name, knew where the roof leaked and what needed repairing. She kept this enormous estate running like a living body. Then one night she was gone, and since then—" Vera paused, her wrinkled fingers tightening slightly around the arm of the chair. "Since then, my grandson hasn't set foot in the East Wing, where her rooms remain exactly as she left them. He doesn't speak her name. He won't look at anything that once belonged to her. He signs his name to whatever papers people place before him, so long as he doesn't have to open the ledgers she left behind. He isn't a fool, girl. He's a man drowning in grief. And from the outside, those two things look exactly alike, even though within, they're separated by an entire world." Arya listened, thinking of the man she had seen the night before at the head of that long table, and suddenly everything fit together into a picture so clear it hurt. Vera turned back to her, and her voice regained its familiar edge. You've been here 3 days, and you've seen more than the last 3 housekeepers saw in 3 months. Don't deny it. I've seen the way you observe. I'll speak plainly because I've no time for courtesies. I want you to work, but not as an ordinary maid. Maids are treated like furniture. Replace one with another and no one notices. I'm giving you authority over the linen stores, the kitchen, and the household expenses, by my authority, an authority in this house that predates that Hollis Brandt everyone fears so much. Then we'll see what you find. Arya hesitated, then said softly that Mr. Vance had told her she wouldn't last a month. A spark almost resembling amusement appeared in Vera's aged eyes. Did he now? She replied, her voice growing dangerously gentle. Then you have 3 weeks to prove him wrong. I suggest you use them well. Arya rose and bowed, and when she had nearly reached the door, the old woman's voice sounded behind her again, making her stop. Girl, Vera said, her gaze sharp as a blade, though something almost warm lay hidden beneath it. That horse came to your hand. In the 40 years I've lived here, I've never seen it go to anyone that way, not even its own master. Remember that when the days ahead become difficult. And Arya stepped out of the room carrying a new weight upon her shoulders, along with the feeling that the house had just quietly drawn her deeper into its heart. Arya didn't squander her newly granted authority on loud commands, because she had learned long ago that in someone else's house, the quickest way to make people resent you was to arrive and immediately begin changing everything. Instead, she started with the smallest things, the things no one cared enough to notice, yet where an entire household was quietly falling apart. She noticed that the kitchen stove belched smoke every morning, forcing Greta to throw open the windows even when the cold cut through the skin, and she realized the chimney hadn't been cleaned in an entire year. She quietly found a local tradesman, paid him $8 from the household funds the mistress had entrusted to her, and the next morning, the kitchen was free of smoke. Greta stood watching the flames burn clear and bright, then turned to Arya with a look she hadn't given her once in the past 3 days. A look no longer filled with suspicion, but touched by something almost like gratitude. Arya said nothing. She merely smiled softly and returned to her work, because she understood that gratitude had value only when it wasn't demanded. She moved on to the linen room, where stacks of expensive sheets and pillowcases were slowly rotting inside damp cupboards, piled upon one another, and forgotten for so long that many had yellowed and begun to smell of mildew. She called in several of the younger maids and showed them how to wash, dry, fold, and rotate the layers of fabric so that no piece remained trapped at the bottom until it was ruined, and the sheets too badly torn to save. She cut into cleaning cloths and bandages so that nothing would go to waste. Millie, the nervous young maid who startled so easily, worked beside Arya throughout the afternoon, and by the end of the day, the girl had begun to talk, hesitantly at first, then with growing ease, telling Arya the small household stories she would never have dared share with anyone else. Arya listened far more than she spoke, and she realized that simply by treating these people as human beings rather than tools, she had quietly earned something all of Hollis Brandt's threats could never purchase: their trust. She repaired the broken kitchen chair with her own hands, tightened the loose screw on a door that had creaked through the night, and replaced the nearly burned-out candles in the corridors with fresh ones that didn't drip wax across everything beneath them. None of those tasks was remarkable on its own, but taken together, day after day, they began to alter the atmosphere of the mansion in a way that was subtle yet undeniable, as though the house were slowly remembering how to become a home. In the kitchen, Arya began keeping the household expense ledger herself, a small book recording everything purchased and the amount actually paid for each item, because the mistress had given her that authority. She wrote carefully and precisely in a neat hand, noting the butcher's price for meat, the cost of vegetables, the price of flour, the plain figures merchants gave her directly at the door. She did this not because she suspected anything, at least not yet, but simply because she couldn't bear waste, and because an honestly kept ledger was one of the few things in life that had always brought her comfort, a place where a column of figures was either right or wrong, and no amount of shouting could turn a false number into a true one. Word spread through the servants' quarters in the way all news traveled through great houses, in whispers beyond the hearing of their employers. A wager had begun in the servants' room during her very first week, $1 on whether the new housekeeper would pack her bags and leave before the end of the month, just as the 3 before her had done, worn down by the cold rooms, the grieving master, and the ruddy-faced manager, who ruled over them all. The odds leaned heavily toward her failure. Arya learned of the wager after only a few days, because a woman who had spent her entire life being invisible heard many things. Louder people missed, but she took no offense. She thought it was a perfectly reasonable bet. In some way, she had made the same wager against herself when she wrote down that false address and came there with only a few coins in her pocket. She didn't intend to win the bet by arguing. She had never won anything in her life through argument. She intended to win it in the only way she trusted, by becoming quiet and indispensable, until one day the house awoke and could no longer remember how it had managed before her, and the wager would be forgotten because the question it asked no longer held any meaning. And when Merrick, the silent butler who trusted no one younger than 60, began bringing the household's problems to her for advice, instead of quietly carrying them alone as he always had before, Arya understood that the current was slowly beginning to turn. 3 weeks passed, and Arya was still there, not only refusing to leave but becoming a quiet, inseparable part of the mansion. And it was on a morning near the end of that month that the house witnessed the moment Ezra Vance's prediction became the most mistaken prophecy he had ever spoken. If Nero, the late wife's horse, was a creature of silent grief standing withdrawn in the darkness, then Onyx was a completely different beast, a younger, massive black stallion that Ezra had recently acquired, possessing hooves as heavy as hammers, and the vicious, unpredictable temperament of a raging storm. That morning, while the stable hands were trying to lead him into the yard so the veterinarian could examine an injury to one of his hind legs, a loud noise from the hay delivery truck drove the animal mad. He didn't shrink into panic as Nero once had. He attacked. Onyx reared, tore the rope from the handler's grasp, and charged straight ahead with his ears pinned flat, his teeth bared, and his front hooves ripping through the air as though he meant to crush anything in his path. One man fell face first onto the gravel and rolled aside by the narrowest margin, and the entire courtyard shattered into chaos, filled with screams. Men scattering in every direction, someone shouting for a tranquilizer gun, another grabbing a pitchfork as though he meant to defend himself against the animal. Arya was crossing the yard with a basket of clean linens in her arms when she heard the commotion, and she didn't hesitate for even a second. She set the basket on the ground, and while every large, powerful man around her was retreating, she was the only one who stepped forward. But this time she didn't approach the animal directly as she had with Nero, because Onyx was in a state of active fury, and walking straight toward an attacking horse was the fastest way to die. Instead, she moved slowly toward the edge of the courtyard, keeping herself outside his direct line of sight, and she began to make a sound, not a shout, but a low, steady tone, almost a hum, the same sound her father had once used in the Kentucky stables during the early mornings of her childhood. The animal faltered for half a beat, his ears twitching, and in that brief moment, Arya took another step, then stopped, then hummed again, never looking directly into his eyes, always keeping her body turned slightly sideways, making herself appear small, dull, and entirely unthreatening. The whole courtyard held its breath. People stopped running, stopped shouting, and stood frozen as they watched the small woman in a maid's uniform slowly close the distance between herself and the black monster no one else dared approach. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Onyx's breathing began to slow. His hooves stopped clawing at the gravel, and the rage in his eyes gradually settled into weary confusion. Arya reached into the pocket of her apron and drew out her father's old, worn lead rope, the one she always carried with her, and held it low for the animal to smell, so he would understand that there was no whip in her hand, no stick, nothing he needed to fear. And the vicious Onyx, the horse that had defeated an entire team of strong men, slowly lowered his enormous head and pressed his muzzle into her palm. A murmur of astonishment spread through the courtyard. Arya slid her other hand beneath the animal's jaw, moving as slowly as dawn, and stood there stroking the massive neck that was still trembling, whispering words no one could clearly hear until his breathing had completely calmed. It was only when she lifted her head that she saw him. Ezra Vance stood beneath the archway leading into the courtyard, and she couldn't tell how long he had been there. This time there was no anger on his face as there had been on that first morning. He was simply watching her, and in those dark blue eyes was something Arya had never seen before. Naked astonishment, almost an awakening, the look of a man who had just witnessed something his reason couldn't explain. Around them, the stable hands whispered among themselves, and Arya caught the words of an older horseman saying that in 30 years of working with horses, he had never seen anyone do what she had done with Onyx, not once. Ezra didn't speak. He only looked at her for one long moment, then turned and walked back into the house, but his steps were slower than usual, as though something inside him had shifted as though some great wall of ice had finally developed its first crack. And standing in the middle of the courtyard, one hand still resting on the neck of the newly calmed horse, Arya understood that she had accidentally done something more dangerous than taming a wild animal. She had made the loneliest man in the house truly see her. After that morning, something changed in the way Ezra Vance moved through his own house, though it was so subtle that only a careful observer like Arya would have noticed. He didn't seek out the kitchen, or go down to the linen room, because to a man like him, those places belonged to another world. But he began to notice the traces she left throughout the mansion. He couldn't help noticing that the kitchen stove no longer sent smoke drifting all the way into the dining room every morning, that the coffee brought to his table was now always steaming hot instead of cold, as it had been for months, and that the candles in the corridors no longer dripped wax in ugly streaks across the floors. Then one evening, when he entered the grand dining room, he stopped at the threshold, the long table with room for 20, the table where he had eaten alone at the far end for the past 14 months, as though seated before a coffin, had been shortened. Someone had removed the extension leaves, and now it was only a modest table large enough for a few people, with his place set there in a way that felt warm and ordinary, no longer making him look like a man dining at the end of an empty river. "Who did this?" he asked Merrick, his voice revealing neither anger nor whatever else he might have been feeling. "Miss Hale thought you might dine more comfortably this way, sir," Merrick replied in his carefully even tone. "She said a man shouldn't have to shout across an entire field just to ask for the salt." A silence followed. "Shall I have it restored, sir?" Ezra looked at the small, welcoming table for a long time. "No," he said. "Leave it." A few days later, he encountered her in the long corridor leading to the library, by accident, because that was almost the only way he encountered anyone during that year. Arya carried a stack of freshly folded linens against her hip, a smear of beeswax still clinging to her wrist, and she stepped aside to let him pass, lowering her eyes as a servant was expected to do. He walked past her, then stopped. "You're the one who calmed Onyx," he said, though he already knew it perfectly well. "Yes, sir," she replied. He looked at her, and this time he truly looked, not with the passing glance of a master toward a servant, but with a gaze that lingered and searched, as though he were trying to understand a riddle. She was small, with dark brown hair and an ordinary face that most people in a crowded room would have passed over without a second thought, except for one thing. When she raised her eyes to answer him, they were calm and clear and entirely without fear, and it had been more than a year since anyone had looked at him that way. His servants looked down at the floor, his grandmother looked straight through him, but this woman looked at him as though he were simply a human being who had asked a question, and she was deciding how much truth he could bear in the answer. It unsettled him. He wasn't accustomed to being seen. "That horse has injured 3 men on my staff since winter," he said, his voice slightly abrupt. "How did you do it?" Arya was silent for a moment, then answered that the animal didn't truly want to hurt anyone. He was only afraid, and a frightened creature would attack anything that came near until it believed there was one hand that hadn't come to cause pain. "You can't force it to believe that," she said softly. "You can only remain still long enough for it to understand on its own." Ezra watched her for a long time after she said it, and Arya had the feeling that she had accidentally spoken about something far greater than a horse, and that he had felt it too. The corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile, but only the faint shadow of something that might once have become one before his life froze over, leaving only a trace of warmth that had long been forgotten. "You don't speak like a maid," he said. "Perhaps because I haven't always been one, sir," she replied, and the moment the words escaped her lips, her heart stumbled because she had revealed more than was safe. But Ezra didn't question her. He only nodded slowly, as though placing that sentence somewhere inside himself to examine later, then continued down the corridor. Yet as he disappeared from sight, the house surrounding him seemed, for one brief moment, a little less like a tomb. Arya remained where she was with the folded linens against her hip, watching his retreating figure, and thought that there was a good man drowning beneath that frozen shell. Then she thought of the hard drive hidden at the bottom of her suitcase, of the real reason she was there, and sternly reminded herself that none of it was her concern. She had come there to remain invisible for 3 months. She hadn't come there to save a Mafia boss. She almost managed to believe it. The more of the household's affairs Arya took into her hands, the more clearly she saw the numbers, and it was the numbers themselves that began whispering to her that something was wrong. It started with something so small that anyone else would have overlooked it. The local butcher, an honest man named Dawson, delivered to the mansion every week, and when Arya paid him directly at the kitchen door as usual, He cheerfully said that the total was $90 that week, just as it was every week, and even showed her his own notebook to prove it. Arya wrote the figure into her small ledger in her neat handwriting, $90, and thought no more about it. But a few days later, while she was assigned to clean the corridor near the servants' quarters, she happened to notice the quarterly expense sheet posted on the household notice board, something displayed more out of tradition than genuine transparency, and her eyes stopped at the line recording the butcher's expenses. The figure written there wasn't 90. It was $145 a week. Arya stood motionless in the cold corridor, staring at the paper for a long time. She didn't touch it. She didn't question anyone. She simply committed the number to memory and quietly walked away, because she was very good at saying nothing. She had spent years practicing it. That evening, in her small room high beneath the roof, she opened her ledger beneath the yellow lamplight and placed it beside the figures she had silently memorized, then began comparing them. The butcher was paid 90, while the household books recorded 145. How much had the candlemaker been paid? She tried to remember the amount he had given her at the door, then compared it to the figure posted on the board, and again there was a difference. The fishmonger, the supplier of flour and grain. Every name she followed revealed another quiet shadow, standing beside the true figure, a shadow taller and darker, and the difference flowed somewhere beyond the ledger, beyond the house, disappearing into a name she hadn't yet seen. Arya sat at the small table for a long time, tracing the columns with her fingertips, as a chill slowly climbed her spine. She had grown up with ledgers. After her mother died, her father had drowned in grief and neglected everything, and 14-year-old Arya had learned to keep the books for the entire horse farm, learned how to make the numbers balance, and she had loved them for a reason she never forgot, because a ledger was the only honest room in the world. There, the word of a small girl carried as much weight as that of any large man. A column either added correctly or it didn't, and no shouting, no threat, could turn a false figure into a true one. That was why, now, when she saw these numbers refusing to match, they lodged in her mind, like a stone swallowed into the stomach, something she couldn't digest. She told herself there might be an explanation. Perhaps there were additional charges she didn't know about, delivery expenses, fees that a large estate had to pay and a new housekeeper hadn't been told. She tried to believe that, but beneath that careful reasoning, the instinct sharpened by a lifetime of hardship was screaming that this wasn't an error, and it wasn't an innocent mistake. The numbers were too regular, too consistent. They formed a pattern, and a pattern was the footprint of a hand. Someone was taking money from the house, not a servant slipping a few coins or a silver spoon into a pocket, but something far larger, far more systematic, far more patient. And Arya, sitting in the darkness with her small and honest ledger, suddenly understood that she had reached the edge of something dangerous. She thought of the grieving man who signed every paper placed before him without bothering to read it, of an entire empire governed by fear and silence, and of the fact that in a house like this, money was never merely money. She closed the ledger and turned off the lamp, but she didn't sleep. She lay in the darkness, listening to the wind, knowing she had found a loose thread, and that if she pulled it, she had no way of knowing how much of the fabric would unravel, or who would realize that she was the one pulling. The opportunity came one afternoon when Hollis Brandt left the mansion for the city on business, and Arya, who had been assigned to inventory the supply room at the end of the north corridor, realized that the storeroom and Hollis's office shared a wall, and that there was a connecting door between them. She told herself she was only counting linens, only doing the work she had been given, but when she tested the handle of the connecting door and found it unlocked, her heart struck hard once, and she knew she was about to cross a line, from which there would be no turning back. She pushed the door open. Hollis's office was orderly to the point of coldness, and on the shelf behind his desk, the first thing that caught Arya's eye made her stop. 2 thick ledgers bound in identical brown leather stood side by side for the same financial year. 2 books. One had worn edges, was old, and had clearly been opened many times. The other was spotless, almost untouched. She shouldn't have laid a hand on them. She knew perfectly well that she shouldn't, but her hands were already reaching forward. She opened the clean ledger first. It was the book meant to be presented, the one shown to others whenever necessary, its figures neat and orderly, portraying an empire that was strained but honest, with every expense transparent. Then she opened the ledger with the worn edges, and the worn ledger was the truth, and the truth was ugly. Here were the real streams of money flowing in, far greater than the other book admitted. Here were the payments she began to understand with an icy shudder. The names of small shops, restaurants, laundries, and family businesses scattered throughout the harbor district, each name accompanied by a monthly sum. Sums she realized weren't rent or payments for goods, but protection money, regular extortion, squeezed from ordinary people under the name of the Vance family. But what chilled her blood wasn't the payments themselves. It was the difference, because she could see clearly that the true amount extracted from those people was far higher than the figure recorded in the ledger, meant for inspection, and that enormous surplus wasn't flowing into the family vault. It was disappearing. It was being funneled into a maze of company names she had never heard before. Hollow names, empty shells. And Arya stood there in the pale light of late afternoon and understood that she was looking at 3 years of systematic theft. This wasn't a servant slipping a few coins into a pocket. This was someone hollowing out an entire empire from its roots, patiently, in neat black ink, while its master drowned in grief upstairs and no longer had the strength to open his eyes and look. Whoever was doing it had waited for exactly this kind of house. A house without its mistress, without anyone watching over it, ruled by a man willing to sign anything so long as he didn't have to face what his wife had left behind. The thief had worked his way inside like termites entering a wooden beam. At that exact moment, Arya heard the outer door open. She had no time to think. She closed the worn ledger, returned it to precisely the same position, aligning every corner as it had been before, then slipped quickly through the connecting door and back into the supply room. And when Hollis Brandt entered, she was standing between the shelves of linen, with a slate in her hand, quietly counting aloud, 20 sets of sheets, only 11 still intact. He stopped in the doorway, and the familiar smile spread across his ruddy face, but his eyes didn't smile at all. "Miss Hale," he said in that sweet voice. "In my office?" "In your storeroom, Mr. Brandt," she replied, without looking up from the slate. "The mistress asked me to inventory these linens." Hollis stepped inside, moving with surprising softness for a large, heavy man, and his gaze traveled around the room, paused at the connecting door, then returned to her face. "You keep a great many records for a housekeeper," he said. Arya looked up, and she allowed herself to meet his eyes directly, calm and completely steady. And in that brief half-second, beneath the ruddy smile, she saw it. He was afraid of her. That was what had brought him here in person, with a smile on his lips. Not the desire to frighten her, but his own fear pulling him toward the room, because a small woman holding a slate had stood too close to a door he didn't want opened. "The mistress always finds work for me to do," she said lightly, closing the slate. "Excuse me." And she walked past him with the slate in her hand, her head still lowered, her manner still humble, but her hands didn't stop trembling until she had reached the staircase. Hollis Brandt wasn't the kind of man who allowed a threat to simply drift away, and 2 days later he found Arya, while she was alone cleaning the tall window frames in the west corridor, where no one else could hear them. He approached without a sound, and she knew he was there only when his shadow fell across the glass before her. "Miss Hale," he said, still using that same sweet voice. "I've been thinking about you." Arya didn't stop wiping the glass and didn't turn around. She only replied softly that she hoped they were pleasant thoughts. Hollis gave a quiet laugh, low and almost friendly, and it was that false friendliness that sent a chill down her spine. "Allow me to offer you some advice," he said, from one employee to another. "This is a very large house, Miss Hale, and there's a great deal of darkness inside it. A young woman with no family, no friends, no one in this world who would notice whether she was alive or dead. That is what you are, isn't it? A girl like that would be wise to keep herself quiet. She should be content with her linens. She should never ask questions when the answers can't possibly do her any good." His smile never faltered as he spoke. "Housekeepers come and go in this place, Miss Hale. They don't last long. I would be very sorry to see you leave before your time." Arya set down the cloth and turned to face him, looking directly into his eyes, calm, clear, and entirely without fear. And in that moment she saw again what she had glimpsed in the storeroom, the thing hiding beneath that smiling, ruddy mask. It wasn't strength, it was fear. He had come there with a smile to frighten her, but it was his own fear that had brought him, because a quiet woman who observed carefully and wrote things down was the greatest danger to a man who had built his entire fortune in theft upon the belief that no one in that house would look, no one would listen, and no one would record what they saw. "I keep very careful records, Mr. Brandt," she said, her voice gentle but precise. "It is the one thing I have always done that no one has ever wanted me to stop doing. I hope you have a pleasant afternoon." Then she picked up her basket and walked away, leaving him standing in the corridor, and she could feel his gaze driving into her back like 2 nails, but she didn't quicken her pace and didn't allow her shoulders to tremble, because she understood that showing him fear now would be just as dangerous as showing him defiance. That night, Arya sat for a long time at the small table in her room and considered every possibility with the cold, clear precision she always applied to numbers. She couldn't go to Ezra Vance, not yet. She was a newly arrived housekeeper carrying an accusation against the man he trusted most, someone who had served there for years, and if she approached him with nothing more than suspicions and a few figures held in her memory, Hollis would call her insane, a jealous servant inventing lies, and she would be thrown out with a poisonous reference before the week was over. And a housekeeper dismissed in disgrace would be traced, questioned about her origins, her name, her past, and behind all those questions waited the very thing she had come there to bury. No, she couldn't go to him with an accusation. She had to go with the truth itself, complete, undeniable, impossible to dismiss with a wave of the hand. She needed both ledgers placed side by side. She needed people who could testify. She needed something that even a clever man like Hollis couldn't laugh away. Then she realized she didn't need to break into his office again, a risk far too great now that he was watching her. She could rebuild the truth from the outside inward. She already had the real figures from the merchants who came to the kitchen door. She could ask to see their books under the honest pretense of wanting to make certain they were paid correctly. She could visit the small shops near the harbor, speak to the people whose money was being squeezed from them, and listen, piece by piece, figure by figure, testimony by testimony. She would build a picture without ever touching his office again. She took out a blank sheet of paper and, in her familiar, neat handwriting, began listing the names she could remember from the worn ledger, the small businesses in the harbor district. And beside each name, she left an empty space, a space she swore to herself she would fill with the truth. She understood that she had stepped into a dangerous game with a man who was both dangerous and afraid, and a frightened man was always twice as dangerous. But as she blew out the candle and remained seated in the darkness, she also understood that for the first time since entering that house, she was no longer merely running away, she was beginning to fight. During the weeks when Arya was quietly rebuilding the truth one piece at a time, she and Ezra Vance gradually drew closer without either of them intending it, and it all began in the library. It was a long room in the north wing, filled with books collected by generations of the Vance family, and the only place in the mansion Ezra still truly visited. The mistress had sent Arya there to find a book, and she found him seated in the low glow of a dying fire, a closed book resting on his knee that he wasn't reading, only sitting with it, like a man keeping something beside him so he wouldn't have to sit entirely alone. The first time, she meant to withdraw, but he told her to stay and find the book, that she wasn't disturbing him. And so, little by little, without any arrangement between them, she was there nearly every evening, and he was there nearly every evening as well. And the library became a shared territory between two people who had nothing in common except loneliness. One night, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers and the entire house had fallen silent, Ezra spoke without looking toward her. "She used to sit in that chair," he said. "The one you're sitting in." Arya remained still. "She used to read ridiculous stories from the newspaper aloud to me until I laughed," he continued, his fingers turning the closed book in his hands as though he had forgotten it was there. "I don't laugh often. She treated every time she made me laugh as a small victory of her own." He paused, and in the red glow of the embers, his face looked older, more exhausted, the cold mask he wore each day slipping away to reveal what lay beneath it. "I was in New York the night she died," he said, his voice so flat it was chilling, the flat voice of a man who had told himself the same story 10,000 times inside his own mind. "There were business matters that couldn't wait. That's what I was told. Important matters. Urgent matters. Things that couldn't be left until the next day. I stayed one more night to finish them. She was gone before I reached the north road leading home." He stared into the embers for a long time. "Business that couldn't wait," he repeated, and something broke very softly in his voice. "I can't remember a single one of those matters now. I traded that entire night away, and I don't even remember what I traded it for." Arya didn't tell him she was sorry. She had learned from his grandmother that it was the most useless sentence in any language, something people threw into silence to fill it rather than touch the pain within it. Instead, she sat quietly for a while, then said softly that people often blame themselves for not being there. But the truth was that even if they had been present, they couldn't have stopped something they had no way of knowing was about to happen, and that the burden he carried wasn't the burden of a guilty man, but the burden of the one who survived, and those were entirely different burdens, heavy in entirely different ways. Ezra turned his head and looked at her across the fading embers, and something opened in his eyes, a nakedness she had never seen before, as though for the first time in a very long while, someone had looked directly at his pain, without stepping back, without becoming afraid, without trying to mend it with empty words. "You carry a loss of your own," he said, and it wasn't a question. Arya was silent for a moment, then answered softly that anyone still alive in this world carried something. He didn't ask further, and she was grateful for that, because between two wounded people, sometimes the greatest gift they could offer one another was not to ask. They remained there in silence for a long time, two wounds reflected in one another through the dying light. A man who had lost the woman who kept the whole house breathing, and a woman running from something she didn't dare name. And in that moment, the distance between master and servant, between a mafia boss and a small young woman, seemed to disappear, leaving only two human beings sitting beside a fire that was almost gone. When Arya finally rose to return to her room, Ezra softly called her name, the first time he had called her Arya instead of Miss Hale. "Thank you," he said, nothing more. And from that closed and frozen man, those two words were worth more than an entire speech. Arya lowered her head, not trusting that her voice wouldn't tremble if she tried to speak, and quietly left him alone with the dying embers. But as she climbed the dark staircase, she realized that her heart was aching, and she feared that feeling more than she feared Hollis Brandt, because she knew what it meant, and she knew that a woman in her circumstances had no right to allow it to grow. Vera Wolf was the one who made everything official, in the way powerful old women often did, which was to say without bothering to ask anyone's opinion. One afternoon, she summoned Arya to the sitting room in the south wing, and when Arya entered, the mistress was seated upright in her familiar armchair, with an open, carved wooden box resting on the small table before her. Inside, upon a layer of faded blue velvet, lay a ring of keys, an access card, and a slip of paper covered with strings of numbers. "This is access to every place in this house," Vera said without hesitation. "The vault, the wine cellar, the storage rooms, the safe in the study, and the alarm codes for the entire mansion. They belonged to Corinne before, and before her, they belonged to the boy's mother. They've remained in this house for generations, always in the hands of the woman who truly cared for it." Her wrinkled hand didn't touch the keys. She simply left them lying there between them. "When Corinne died," Vera continued, her voice growing lower, "Hollis Brandt gathered all of them and locked them inside his office. He told my grandson it was for safekeeping, and my grandson was too deeply buried in grief to see the truth. A man who holds every key to a house holds the house itself. Girl, I've taken them back. Don't ask me how. I'm 79 years old, and I have my ways." She looked up, and a cold, sharp light gleamed in her aged eyes. "Now they belong to you, not hidden in your pocket, but worn where the entire house can see them and know who opens its doors." Arya stood motionless. "Madam," she said softly, "I'm only a housekeeper. The whole district will talk." "Let them talk," Vera cut in. "I haven't lived all these years only to be lectured about gossip by a girl who just tamed the wildest horse in the stable. You've been running this house for 3 weeks with nothing but my spoken permission and your own 2 hands. It's time the house showed that truth to the world. Take them, Arya, and when the day comes that someone tries to tear them from your hands, and it will come, hold on tightly." Arya picked up the ring of keys. They were heavier than she had expected. From that afternoon onward, she wore them at her waist, and their soft metallic clinking traveled ahead of her through every corridor of the Vance mansion, a sound that, week after week, gradually became the sound of the house itself, remembering how to be a home. The servants heard it, and knew she was coming. The merchants at the kitchen door heard it, and knew she was coming. And Ezra Vance heard it too. He saw the keys for the first time the following evening, when she sat with him in the library, their metal glinting at the waist of her simple gray dress. He looked at them for a long time, and something passed over his face that she couldn't read. Perhaps pain, perhaps the memory of another woman who had once worn them, or perhaps the first stirring of a feeling he still didn't dare name. "My grandmother gave you those keys," he said, "and it wasn't a question." "Yes, sir," she replied. "I mentioned to the mistress that giving them to a maid would make the entire district talk." "Let them talk," he said, and Arya was startled to realize that he had repeated his grandmother's words exactly, without even knowing it. He weighed the closed book in his hand, then said quietly, almost to himself, that Corinne had once told him a house couldn't be run by a man's signature alone. It needed a woman's keys and a woman's eyes, because without them, it would rot from within, while its master calmly signed his name to its ruin. I didn't understand what she meant then, Ezra said, and he looked up at Arya across the fire, his gaze no longer carrying the wary curiosity of those first days, but something entirely different. The beginning of trust, the kind of trust a man who had been betrayed by his own indifference had paid dearly to learn how to give. I understand now, he said. I've signed my name to too many things this year without bothering to read them. Arya's heart faltered. It was the closest he had come to the truth she was quietly rebuilding, figure by figure, inside the locked drawer in her room. She answered carefully that perhaps it was time he began reading again. He looked at her for a long time, and for one moment she thought he would ask her directly what she knew, but he wasn't ready, and truthfully, neither was she. The moment passed, the fire burned lower, and they remained together in the shared territory of the library, each of them holding one piece of the same truth, neither yet willing to place it on the table between them. The new ring of keys opened more doors for Arya than she had ever imagined, and one of them led to the tack room behind the stables, a small space thick with the smell of leather and conditioning oil that no one had bothered to clean in a very long time. She went there late one afternoon with the simple intention of taking inventory and putting the old saddles in order, but it was Nero who led her to what she found. The black horse that had belonged to the late wife now trusted her completely, and whenever she entered the stable, he lifted his head and gave a soft whinny of welcome. The creature no one had been able to touch for more than a year now, pressing his muzzle against her shoulder like an enormous dog. That afternoon, while she was cleaning the room, she noticed an old saddle hanging by itself in the farthest corner, separated from the others and covered beneath a thick layer of dust, and embroidered into the worn leather was a small handwritten initial, the letter C. Corinne's saddle. Arya paused, overcome by a strange reluctance, the feeling of someone about to touch something that had belonged to the dead. But she took it down to clean it, and as her hand moved along the padding underneath, her fingers found an unusual raised spot, a line of stitching that didn't match the rest, a section of leather that had been cut open and clumsily sewn back together by hand. Her heart began to beat faster. She had sewn a hiding place just like it into the bottom of her own suitcase, and she recognized at once the traces left by someone trying to conceal something. She hesitated for only a moment, then took the small knife she always carried in her pocket and carefully cut through the stitches. Inside the leather padding, wrapped in a piece of soft cloth, was a small silver USB drive, and beside it, a sheet of paper folded into quarters and yellowed with age. Arya sank onto the stool in the tack room, her hands trembling slightly, and unfolded the paper. The handwriting belonged to a woman, rounded and hurried, the words written in haste or fear. Arya read, and what she saw seemed to make the entire room grow several degrees colder. The paper wasn't a letter. It was a collection of scattered notes, figures, abbreviated names, and in the middle of them, underlined twice, was a question the writer appeared to have asked herself: why the payments didn't match, and why, when she asked about them, H told her not to touch those ledgers again. H, a single letter. But Arya didn't need long to guess. Beneath it, in shakier handwriting, as though written at another time, later, was a line that sent an icy chill through her spine, saying that if anything happened to her, it wasn't an accident. Arya read that sentence 3 times, and with each reading, another cold piece fell into place inside her mind, though she still didn't dare allow herself to see the entire picture they were forming. Corinne had known. The woman who had kept the whole house breathing, the woman everyone said had died in an accident, had discovered something about the figures that didn't match, had questioned the one person she should never have questioned, and had been frightened enough to hide the evidence in the most secret place she could imagine, inside the saddle of the horse only she dared ride. And then she had died. Arya sat motionless for a very long time in the pale late afternoon light fading through the small window, the USB drive cold in her palm, and she understood that what she had found wasn't merely evidence of theft. It was something far darker, something she still didn't have the courage to name. Nero, in the stall beside the room, gave a soft snort and turned his head toward her, his large black eyes watching her as darkness settled, as though the animal understood that this woman had just touched the very secret he had silently guarded for 14 months. Arya wrapped the USB drive and the note in the soft cloth again and hid them inside her dress, close against her chest, where she could feel their weight with every rapid beat of her heart. She didn't yet know what the USB drive contained. She didn't know what to do with what she had just read. But she knew one thing with cold certainty, that she had crossed a new threshold. That this was no longer merely about stolen money, and that within this dark house, one woman's death might not have been what everyone still believed it to be. Delphine Ashe arrived one afternoon at the beginning of the month, and from the moment her elegant automobile came to a stop before the mansion, Arya sensed that a new kind of danger had crossed the threshold, one entirely different from Hollis Brandt. Delphine was Ezra Vance's cousin, the only daughter of his late aunt, a 36-year-old woman who had been born into luxury, but now possessed only the appearance of it. Her father had gambled away every last piece of the family fortune, while her late husband had left her a widow's allowance that dwindled with every passing quarter. She was beautiful, but hers was a sharp, unyielding beauty, honed by years of smiling in the drawing rooms of people who had once been her equals but had long since moved beyond her reach. Since Corinne's death, she had visited the Vance mansion more and more often, staying longer each time, and on this occasion, she arrived with enough luggage for a visit that had no appointed end. During the very first afternoon tea, when Arya carried the tray into the south wing sitting room to serve the mistress and her guest, Delphine began probing her, and she did it so delicately that someone less perceptive would never have noticed. "Hale," she said, turning the name over on her tongue as though tasting a piece of candy. "Hale, where does that name come from, I wonder? There are Hales in Virginia, as I recall. Are you one of the Virginia Hales?" Arya answered softly, her eyes still lowered toward the tea tray. "That no, madam." Her father had only been an ordinary countryman, with nothing grand about him. "Is that so?" Delphine said, and her smile never touched her eyes. "An ordinary man who left you nothing, so you were forced to serve others, laying their tables and washing their linens. How exhausting it must be, to be born only slightly above your station, not quite belonging to one world, yet not quite belonging to the other, not one of those who are served, but never entirely content to be among those who serve. One must always be so careful not to place a foot wrong." Arya poured the tea, her hand perfectly steady, and understood that this wasn't harmless conversation. It was an inspection, a hand lightly tapping along the walls in search of a hollow place. "I'm afraid I don't possess your gift for observing people, madam," she replied, setting the teacup gently before Delphine. "I've only learned how to observe piles of linen." From the depths of her armchair, Vera Wolfe made a small sound that, from a less dignified woman, would have been a mocking snort. Delphine smiled thinly, took a sip of tea, and didn't remove her sharp gaze from Arya's face for even a second. "I do have a talent for observing people, Miss Hale," she said softly, almost intimately. "It is the only gift I have left. My cousin still thinks I'm an idle, useless woman, but I watch." And when Arya met those hard, bright eyes, she understood that the true enemy in the house wasn't the smiling, ruddy-faced manager. It was this woman. Hollis was greedy and dangerous, but he acted for money, and people who acted for money could be predicted. Delphine acted from a deeper, more primitive hunger, the craving to reclaim the position life had torn from her hands, and a hunger like that never slept. Over the following days, Arya watched quietly, and she began to see something no one else in the house seemed to notice. Delphine and Hollis, two people who appeared to have little connection, were in fact bound together by a hidden thread. She saw them exchange fleeting glances over dinner. She saw Hollis, who was miserly with everyone else, become strangely indulgent whenever Delphine made a request. And once, while passing the partly closed door of the study, she overheard Hollis's low voice saying something about her smaller debts having been taken care of and that she needn't concern herself with them. Arya fitted the pieces together and understood the true nature of their alliance. Delphine was an impoverished woman moving among people who had once been her equals, and Hollis, drawing from the secret river of money he had siphoned away, had quietly paid her debts, purchasing her loyalty, while in return she used her sharp mind and her position within the family to protect him and clear his path toward the master of the house. Each one supported the other. Neither could have done alone what they were doing together, and both understood the danger of exposure. But now a common threat had appeared, a small housekeeper moving quietly through the mansion as though she were its mistress, with keys clinking at her waist and eyes that saw far too much. And when Arya caught Delphine silently assessing her over the rim of her teacup one afternoon, She knew the woman had sensed what Hollis, dulled by the coarseness of greed, hadn't yet understood. The new housekeeper wasn't merely unusually capable, she was hiding something. And Delphine Ashe, who had nothing left in the world but her gift for observation and the desperation of a gambler placing her final wager, wouldn't stop until she discovered what it was. Delphine Ashe wasn't the kind of woman who waited for answers to find their own way to her. And while Arya quietly rebuilt the evidence against Hollis one piece at a time, Delphine was just as quietly rebuilding Arya's past one piece at a time. And the race between the two women had begun, though neither ever spoke of it aloud. With what little money she had left, and a few old connections that hadn't completely dried up, Delphine contacted an acquaintance who worked as a private investigator in the South and asked what seemed like a simple question: whether anyone had ever heard of a young woman named Arya Hale, about 27 years old, raised on a horse farm in Kentucky, who had left her home in great haste during the previous autumn. The question was sent out, and then she waited, patient as a spider at the edge of its web. Arya didn't know exactly what was happening, but the instincts sharpened by a lifetime of running began sounding their warnings. She noticed Delphine questioning the servants about her, asking who had recommended her for the position, whether she had ever mentioned her family, whether she had ever received letters from anyone. She noticed Delphine's gaze lingering on her longer and more sharply, carrying the almost triumphant expression of someone drawing close to her destination. Then one morning, as Arya happened to pass the sitting room, she heard Delphine speaking on the telephone in a low voice. And though she caught only a few scattered words, she clearly heard Kentucky in autumn, and her heart seemed to drop straight through her body. The circle was tightening. She had lived with fear long enough to recognize this feeling, the sensation of a door slowly closing behind her. That night, seated in her small room beneath the roof, Arya forced herself to think with cold clarity, setting panic aside as she had always done. If Delphine uncovered her past, the most dangerous thing wouldn't be the false documents she had used to secure employment. The greatest danger was the hard drive hidden at the bottom of her suitcase, and now the USB drive and Corinne's note that she kept close against her chest. If anyone searched her room, if anyone went through her belongings, everything she had risked her life to protect would fall into the hands of the very people it might condemn. She couldn't keep all her eggs in one basket any longer. She needed to move the evidence out of the house and place it somewhere safe, somewhere the truth couldn't be buried with her even if she were arrested, dismissed, or something worse happened. The following morning, she asked the mistress for permission to go out for several hours on the pretense of purchasing a few supplies for the kitchen, a perfectly reasonable errand for the woman overseeing the household, and Vera approved without asking questions. Arya took a car into downtown Providence, and there, among unfamiliar, crowded streets where no one knew her face, she carried out the plan she had spent the entire night calculating. She copied everything, carefully creating duplicates. She went to a bank and rented a safe deposit box under her real name, paid cash for an entire year, and placed inside it a copy of everything she had collected, the figures, the testimonies she had written down, and a copy of the data from Corinne's USB drive that she still hadn't fully deciphered. Then she did one more thing, something that made her hands tremble as she carried it out. She went to the office of a lawyer she had carefully researched beforehand, a man with no connection to the Vance family, and left him a sealed envelope with instructions that if she failed to return for it within 30 days, or if anything happened to her, the envelope was to be delivered to federal investigators. She offered no further explanation, and the lawyer, accustomed to clients who carried secrets, didn't ask. When Arya stepped out of that office beneath the gray afternoon sky, she felt a strange relief mingled with terror, because she knew she had just done something irreversible. She had turned herself into a ticking time bomb. As long as she remained alive and free, the secret would stay silent. But if Hollis or Delphine moved against her, her death would automatically light the fuse and make everything explode. It was the only shield she had, fragile and desperate, but it was all a small, solitary woman like her could arm herself with. On the journey back to the mansion, as she looked through the fogged window at the cold gray harbor receding behind her, Arya clenched her hands in her lap and tried to keep them from shaking. She knew time was no longer on her side. Delphine was drawing closer to the truth about her, while she still hadn't completed the picture of Hollis, and between those two hidden races, only one could reach the finish first. When the car turned onto the long gravel road leading to the Vance mansion in the fading twilight, she looked up at the great house looming against the sky, its dark windows like watching eyes, and for the first time since the day she arrived, it no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a trap slowly closing its jaws. Everything broke open one night, the way things that had been smoldering too long often did. All at once, Arya was in the stables later than usual, checking the healing wound on Onyx beneath the yellow lamplight, when she heard gravel crunch beneath a footstep that didn't belong there. She looked up, and in the darkness between two pools of light, a man she had never seen before was walking toward her with the quiet, purposeful stride of someone hired to do a job and finish it cleanly. Her instincts screamed before reason could understand, and she stepped back, her heart pounding, one hand searching the stable wall for anything she could use. The man didn't say a word, but Nero did. The black horse, which had guarded its mistress's secret for 14 months, suddenly reared inside the stall and let out a long, piercing cry, hammering its hooves against the wooden wall, and that sudden eruption of chaos gave Arya the moment she needed. She threw herself beyond the man's reach and screamed, and her cry, joined by the horse's furious call, tore through the stillness of the night and carried all the way to the mansion. The courtyard lights blazed on, footsteps came running. Merrick was the first to appear in the stable doorway, followed by 2 of the family's men, and the stranger, realizing his opportunity had vanished, turned and disappeared into the darkness as quickly as he had emerged, leaving Arya standing there trembling against the stable wall, her heart pounding, but alive. It was in the middle of that chaos, as Ezra Vance strode toward her with his face darkened by anger and fear, while half the household spilled into the courtyard in night robes beneath the harsh lights, that Delphine Ashe stepped out onto the portico carrying a file in one hand, her face wearing the cold triumph of a gambler who had revealed her final card at precisely the right moment. "Cousin," she called, loudly enough for everyone in the courtyard to hear. "Before you waste any more concern on this woman, I think you ought to know who she truly is." Every eye turned toward Arya. "She isn't who she claims to be," Delphine continued, her voice sweet while every word cut like a blade. "Her name is real enough, Arya Hale, but everything else is a lie. False documents, a false reference. She fled Kentucky last autumn, running from something she doesn't want anyone to know, and she slipped into this house under a fabricated history. She stepped forward and delivered the final blow. When a woman goes to such lengths to conceal her identity, one has to wonder what else she might be hiding. Someone else's records, perhaps. She has been lurking around offices, copying papers, and asking questions everywhere. You have sheltered a snake inside your own home, Ezra. A snake that came here for purposes of its own, and now it has nearly led a stranger directly into your courtyard in the middle of the night. Silence fell across the courtyard, heavy as lead. Arya stood there, damp with mist and trembling. And when she looked at Ezra, what she saw on his face broke her heart. The door was closing. She watched it happen before her eyes, the way his gaze, which only hours earlier had softened when it rested on her in the firelight of the library, now turned cold and sealed itself shut, the way he looked at her as though she were an unexpected account placed before him, exactly as he had looked at her on that damp first morning. She saw that he believed Delphine, the man who had already been betrayed by his own indifference, the man who had only just begun learning how to trust again, had now been told that the only woman in the past year who had dared meet his eyes without fear was living under false papers, concealing her past, and secretly searching through his records, exactly as his cousin claimed. Arya watched him retreat into himself, watched the library door slam shut behind his eyes. "Is it true?" he asked, and his voice was no longer the voice of the man beside the glowing embers. It was cold and distant, like the stone beneath the portico on that first day. "Did you use a false name? Did you flee Kentucky? Did you copy records from my house?" And Arya, standing in the courtyard with every eye upon her, with the man she had come to care for looking at her as though she were a traitor, realized that the moment she had feared since the night she fled had finally arrived, and strangely, when it came, the fear inside her disappeared. She had spent her entire life remaining invisible in order to stay safe, and now that safety was ending in the middle of a courtyard before everyone, yet the sky hadn't fallen. Only the truth remained, and truth, at least, was simple. She lifted her head and looked directly into his eyes without turning away. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady in the cold night. "Everything she just said is true. I did use a false name. I did run away, and I did copy your records. But you're asking the wrong question, sir. The question you should be asking is why." "Why?" Arya repeated, and her voice carried across the silent courtyard. No longer the voice of a maid, but the voice of a woman finally allowing herself to be heard. "I fled Kentucky because I worked in a house where I accidentally saw something I was never meant to see. and I took the evidence with me, and there are very powerful people who want me silenced forever. I came here to disappear, but I couldn't close my eyes and pretend not to see, because I realized this house was being hollowed out in exactly the same way. She turned sharply toward Hollis Brandt, who stood at the edge of the crowd with the smile on his ruddy face beginning to stiffen. I copied your records because he keeps 2 sets of books, Mr. Vance. One set for display, and one containing the truth. For a long time, he has been extorting far more protection money from the small businesses in the Harbor District than he ever reported to you, and the difference, millions of dollars, has been diverted into his own pockets through shell companies. For the past 14 months, you have been signing your name to your own destruction without reading a word, because you couldn't bring yourself to open the ledgers your wife left behind. Hollis laughed, a soft, pleasant, easy laugh, and that was his mistake. He knew at the instant the sound left his mouth, because no one laughed in the face of an honest accounting. Ezra didn't look at Hollis. He looked at Arya, and something was moving behind his eyes. "You have proof," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I do," she answered, "but it isn't only about the money." She reached inside her dress, drew out the soft cloth, and opened it beneath the courtyard lights, revealing the small silver USB drive and the yellowed sheet of paper. "This," she said, her voice trembling for the first time, "I found inside Corinne's saddle." She hid it there. She discovered that the numbers didn't match, just as I did. She questioned him, just as I did, and she wrote in her own hand that if anything happened to her, it wasn't an accident. The entire courtyard seemed to stop breathing. Arya looked directly at Ezra and spoke the words she knew would shatter his world into pieces. "Your wife didn't die in a car accident, sir. She died because she found this truth before I did, and the person most afraid of her discovering it is the man standing there laughing." Ezra's face turned white as paper. Slowly, he turned toward Hollis, and there was something in those dark blue eyes now that made even the hardest men in the courtyard step back. 14 months of frozen fury melting into fire. Hollis raised both hands, and at last his smile broke apart. "She's insane," he said, his voice losing its smoothness for the first time. "This is all the invention of a desperate servant. She has nothing." But at that moment, a voice rose from within the crowd, low, hoarse, and trembling, a voice no one had expected to hear. "She does," Merrick said. Every head turned. The 61-year-old butler, the most loyal man in the mansion, the man who had served the Vance family for 40 years, stepped out of the shadows with a gun in his hand, but the barrel wasn't aimed at Arya. It was aimed at Hollis Brandt. "She is telling the truth," Merrick said, and tears streamed down the face that no one throughout this entire story had ever seen reveal a single emotion. "About everything. I know because I was the one who did it." Ezra staggered as though someone had struck him. Merrick never took his eyes from Hollis, but he spoke to his master, and every word seemed torn from his chest. "He had my daughter in his hands, sir. She fell into debt because of one mistake, and Hollis bought that debt. He told me that if I didn't do what he ordered, she would disappear and no one would ever find her body. Mistress Corinne came too close to the truth. He gave me the order, and his voice caught, I chose my daughter over her. I have lived with that choice every day for the past 14 months. I can't enter the East Wing any more than you can, sir. Every night, I prayed that someone would uncover the truth, so I wouldn't have to be the only one carrying it any longer." He tightened his grip on the gun, both hands shaking violently. "This girl found it, and I won't let you kill another person to bury it." Hollis Brandt looked around the courtyard at the faces of the men who had once obeyed his commands, and he saw in their eyes that the small empire of fear he had built had collapsed in less than a minute. He tried to run, but Ezra's men closed in around him, and Ezra Vance simply stood there in the cold courtyard, looking at the weeping butler, looking at the woman damp with mist, holding the truth in her palm, while the silent world in which he had imprisoned himself for the past 14 months finally shattered around him. What followed was something the Vance mansion had not witnessed throughout its 14 months of silence. Hollis Brandt was restrained by the family's men that very night, and by morning, instead of dealing with him in the way the underworld usually dealt with its own, Ezra Vance did something different, something that even he, only a few months earlier, might never have imagined himself capable of doing. He turned Hollis over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, along with both sets of ledgers, the statements from the small business owners, and copies of the evidence Arya had left at the lawyer's office. Furthermore, Ezra took the hidden portable hard drive Arya had carried from Kentucky and handed it directly to his federal contacts, using his immense influence to ensure that the powerful figures who had been hunting her ever since her flight were dismantled by the law once and for all. The hired assassin who had fled the stables that night was also quickly captured on the North Road, sealing Hollis's fate completely. He understood that doing so meant light would be cast into the darkest corners of his own empire, but he chose it because, for the first time in a very long while, he wanted to build something that could stand beneath the light instead of surviving forever in darkness. Merrick surrendered himself and confessed everything, and although the law would pass its own judgment upon him, both Arya and Ezra understood that the old butler had been torn between his daughter's life and his own conscience, and that a human being shouldn't be defined forever by the worst mistake fear had forced him to make. His daughter was taken out of danger, and that was the only thing Merrick asked before lowering his head and accepting whatever remained of his life. That afternoon, for the first time in 14 months, Ezra Vance entered the East Wing. He stood for a long time before the pair of dark wooden doors and the faded velvet rope, then took it down, opened the doors, and stepped into the room where everything belonging to Corinne remained exactly as she had left it. Arya stood silently at the threshold and didn't follow, leaving him alone with the wife he could finally mourn. And when he placed his hand upon the honest ledgers she had left behind, the books he hadn't possessed the courage to touch for more than a year, he whispered something only she could hear: an apology, a farewell, a promise. Then there was Delphine. She sat curled into a corner of the sitting room throughout that morning, watching the entire machine she had helped construct collapse into ruin, and when Ezra prepared to punish her as justice demanded, sending her away penniless with disgrace following her for the rest of her life, Arya stopped him. She stepped toward the woman who had done everything in her power to destroy her, and there was no triumph in her, because she had learned long ago that triumph was exactly what an enemy waited to see. "You spent family money to pay your debts," Arya said softly, "and that was wrong. But you didn't squeeze the throats of poor people. You didn't order anyone killed. You watched and remained silent because you were afraid. And that is exactly what I did until I could no longer bear to do it." She looked into Delphine's hard, bright eyes, now filled with tears, and told her there was a small house at the edge of the estate, standing empty, where a woman could still live with dignity, serving no one and needing no one to serve her, and no longer exhausting herself by watching every step she took. "Why?" Delphine asked, and the question that escaped her wasn't graceful. It was torn from somewhere deep inside. "Because I know exactly how exhausting it is," Arya answered. "And because a house that has just driven out a thief shouldn't celebrate by creating a beggar." Delphine began to weep, and for the first time in many years, she wasn't crying from bitterness, but from something whose name she had almost forgotten. That spring passed into summer, and the Vance mansion slowly learned how to breathe again. Every dollar Hollis had extorted from the small businesses was returned, one shop at a time. Whatever could be recovered was given back, and whatever couldn't be recovered, Ezra repaid from his own fortune, considering it a small price to reclaim the soul of his house. On a quiet evening near the end of summer, he found Arya in the library, where everything had begun, and told her he had no intention of offering her some arranged bargain. She had her own freedom, he said. She could leave, testify, begin her life again anywhere she wished. She didn't need any man, least of all a man like him. "That is precisely why I'm asking," he said, and the voice of the man who had once been cold as stone now trembled softly. "Because I want to spend the rest of my life being seen by the only person who has never once been afraid of me." Arya looked at him for a long time, and she thought of the time she had intended to spend invisible in order to remain safe, and she realized that safety was too small a word, that she had been safe for most of her life, and had never once been truly seen until that spring. "Yes," she said, and the faintest smile touched the corner of her lips. "But on one condition. Every last dollar taken from those ordinary people must be returned in full by the ones responsible." Ezra Vance laughed, and the sound filled the library, a sound the house had not heard since that tragic night. Outside, beneath the gentle golden light of evening, Nero and Onyx grazed peacefully beside one another in the paddock, two animals that had once carried the fury of loss within them, and had now found peace again, just as two people inside the house had learned that even the deepest wound could heal when met by a hand patient enough not to turn away. And Arya Hale, who had come there to disappear, ultimately became the person most completely seen, and she understood something she would carry with her for the rest of her life, that being seen by the right person wasn't the danger she had feared all her life, but the only true safety worth having. The story of Arya and Ezra leaves us with a profound lesson that a person's dignity is never measured by wealth, power, or position, but by the way we treat those more vulnerable than ourselves, and that compassion, even when offered to someone who has harmed us, is the greatest strength capable of healing wounds that once seemed impossible to mend. Sometimes, what a person drowning in sorrow needs most isn't advice or pity, but simply someone brave enough to look directly at them without running away. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so we can continue listening together to more meaningful and captivating stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And what did it remind you of in the real world around us, where the quietest people sometimes carry the greatest courage within them? Please leave a comment and share what you truly feel from the depths of your heart, because we genuinely want to hear your thoughts. Thank you for staying with this story until its final words. May everyone watching this video always be blessed with good health, a joyful and peaceful life, and days filled with love. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.